It started with a single cry echoing through Redwater Ridge, a cry so desperate that even the desert wind couldn't drown it out. At the bottom of a 3-meter mud pit, a lioness was sinking fast, trapped, injured, fighting just to keep her head above the sludge. Her 2 cubs stood helpless at the top, crying and pacing, unable to reach her. There was no escape, and no one around for miles, until an old mustang heard her. He looked once, then turned and ran, not away, but to find help. And what he set in motion would leave everyone speechless. No one on Redwater Ridge knew a miracle was coming, because on this quiet morning, a mother lion was only 3 steps away from the moment that would break her world apart. If you love true, emotional wildlife stories, hit subscribe so you never miss the next one. Dawn washed over Redwater Ridge in a slow bloom of color, painting the jagged cliffs in bands of copper, gold, and soft rose. The desert exhaled as the first warmth touched it, pushing away the last traces of night. A thin breeze drifted through the sagebrush, stirring pale green leaves that glittered faintly in the early light. The world felt peaceful, so peaceful it almost hummed. Liora moved through the tall grass with the quiet certainty of a lioness who knew every fold and shadow of this land. Her muscles rolled beneath her tawny coat, catching the sun in warm highlights as she stepped onto a gentle rise overlooking the valley. She paused and lifted her head, drawing in the morning air. The breeze carried the sweetness of wildflowers blooming somewhere upwind, the earthy musk of small mammals tucked beneath rocks, and the cool metallic scent of shaded stone. Nothing dangerous, nothing wrong. At least nothing she could recognize. Ash trailed close behind her, trying to copy the way she walked, steady, deliberate, important. His small paws pressed neatly into the sand, and though his tail twitched with excitement, he forced himself to focus. He wanted to understand this world the way his mother did. He wanted to smell danger before it appeared, to sense shifts in wind, to grow into the lion he believed he was meant to become. Flint was having none of that. He bounded ahead in clumsy bursts, leaping into sunbeams, pouncing on dancing dust motes, then darting sideways to chase shadows as if they were living things. His joy was chaotic and loud, a vibrant spark that refused to be contained. Every crunch of gravel fascinated him. Every rise in the earth begged to be climbed. Every sound felt like a mystery demanding a reckless, enthusiastic investigation. Liora watched him with the kind of patience built over seasons of survival. She loved his fire, even if it frightened her sometimes. Flint's spirit burned bright, and in a land like Redwater Ridge, bright flames could be snuffed out quickly. The valley stretched wide before them, glowing under the early sun. A raven circled high above, calling once before drifting east. Lizards pushed out from under warm stones, their tiny feet skittering rapidly over the dirt. Far in the distance, the faint gurgle of a creek threaded through the silence, carrying memories of water and life. It was the kind of morning predators cherished. Calm, predictable, almost tender. Ash paused beside Liora and inhaled again, trying to read the wind with the same calm precision she carried in every breath. His first attempt was too quick, but the second was slower, deeper. Liora brushed her muzzle against his cheek, a silent affirmation that he was learning. Flint barreled into them both a heartbeat later, rolling them into a knot of flailing paws. Ash hissed in annoyance while Flint squeaked with delight, kicking up a cloud of dust as he scrambled upright. Liora shook her head softly and nudged them onward. They walked along the ridge, sunlight sliding across the sandstone walls in shifting sheets. The warmth was gentle at first, wrapping the three lions in a soft, golden cocoon. For a moment, Liora allowed herself to believe the day was hers to enjoy. Another morning of teaching her sons how to listen to the rocks, how to feel the earth beneath their paws, how to exist without fear. But something subtle broke the illusion. A small shift in the wind brushed against her whiskers, so faint it could have been imagined. The scent was nearly nothing, a thread of metallic tang carried from somewhere beyond the cliffs. It faded as quickly as it came, slipping back into the desert like a shadow retreating into stone. Liora lifted her head higher, ears twitching. Ash noticed the change first. He pressed into her leg, wide eyes searching her face. Flint paused too, sensing the tension even though he didn't understand it. The world around them was still beautiful, still glowing, still quiet. And yet, something in the air felt thinner than before, stretched just slightly too far, like the morning was holding its breath. Liora nudged both cubs forward, urging them to stay close. She didn't know why unease crawled along her spine. She only knew one truth. The desert never shifted without reason. And today, Redwater Ridge had begun to shift. The sun was higher now, brushing the top edges of Redwater Ridge with a fierce brightness that made every stone shimmer. Liora guided her cubs along a narrow slope, her paws silent and sure as she moved through the uneven landscape. Ash stayed close at her side, matching each step with careful precision, while Flint trailed slightly behind, nose pressed to the ground as he followed some invisible trail only he could sense. A faint gust rolled down from the upper cliffs, carrying with it a smell that did not belong. Liora paused mid-step, her head rising sharply. Dust, wildflowers, lizard musk, and then something else, something cold and metallic, faint but unmistakable, a wrongness in the wind. She narrowed her eyes. Flint did not notice at all. His ears shot upward suddenly as a harsh, jagged cry split across the valley. It wasn't the smooth call of a hawk or the soft chatter of smaller birds. This sound scraped the air raw, sharp enough to make even Ash flinch back. Flint took one step toward the cliffs, then another, his eyes wide with electric curiosity. The cry came again, ragged, frantic, echoing along the canyon walls. Flint bolted forward. Liora lunged to block him, her body sliding in front of his path just as he tried to squeeze past. Ash pressed himself into her side, trembling at the unfamiliar sound. Liora crouched slightly, scanning the cliffs. Sunlight glared off the rock face, but she could see the source of the noise now, far above, tucked between two jagged boulders. Something thrashed and beat its wings. An eagle. A large one. Its left wing twisted at an unnatural angle as it struggled against something that held it tight. Each desperate flap sent small stones clattering down from the ledge. The metallic scent on the wind grew sharper. Flint tried to wriggle around Liora again, driven by a mix of fascination and confusion. To him, it was simply a creature making a loud noise. To Liora, it was something far worse. A wounded predator trapped by something human. She nudged Ash closer to her and kept her tail low, signaling caution. The eagle screamed again, the sound tearing across the valley. Flint shivered, but did not back away. His small heart raced with the urge to investigate, to understand what he did not yet fear. A narrow side path led toward the cliff, twisting upward in a broken line carved by old erosion. Half of it was hidden by brush. The rest was littered with loose gravel that glinted under the sunlight. Even from where Liora stood, She could see parts of the ledge shifting slightly, as if the earth itself was trying to warn her against climbing it. The cubs, of course, didn't notice. To them, the path looked like an invitation. Ash shrank back when the eagle shrieked again, but Flint took a step forward, then two, his tail flicking with reckless bravery. He cast only one brief glance back at his mother before inching toward the start of the trail. Liora stepped in front of him once more, this time with a firmer push of her shoulder. Flint huffed in protest but stopped. She lowered her head and breathed in deeply. The scent of rusted metal flooded her senses now, an unnatural bite cutting through the desert air. It made her skin prickle. She turned her gaze upward. Now she could see it clearly. A thin, rust-colored wire wrapped around the eagle's wing, tangled between the rocks like a forgotten trap, waiting to claim anything unfortunate enough to cross its path. Danger. Not the kind she could fight. Not the kind she could outrun. The kind she needed to avoid, but Flint sensed only the drama of the thrashing bird. He darted sideways suddenly, slipping past Liora's front paw and sprinting up the first few feet of the incline before she could stop him. Gravel scattered under his paws, clinking down the slope in tiny, dangerous cascades. Ash let out a tiny cry. Liora's heart lurched. She launched after him with a burst of speed, cutting off his path before he climbed any higher. Flint skidded to a halt, panting, his eyes wide and filled with frustration. He didn't understand why she blocked him. He didn't understand that bravery, at the wrong moment, could be fatal. The ground trembled under them, a small, almost imperceptible shift. Liora froze. Her paws felt the vibration before her ears recognized the faint crumble of stone far above. Something was unstable. The eagle slammed against the wire again, sending a fresh shower of pebbles raining down. Flint watched them tumble, mesmerized. Ash pressed closer to Liora, his fear sharpening. Liora nudged both cubs back toward the valley floor, urging them to return to safety. But instinct kept pulling her eyes upward. Something was wrong with the ridge. Something was waiting to break. The wind shifted again, this time carrying the metallic scent straight into her lungs. The desert was speaking, warning, whispering danger into her bones. Still, Flint stared up at the wounded bird with glowing curiosity. Ash leaned into her for comfort, and Liora, standing between the rising threat and her two cubs, felt the first ripple of dread tighten in her chest. What waited above them was not a simple disturbance. It was the beginning of everything that would follow. The narrow trail clung to the cliffside like an old scar, thin, uneven, and carved by years of harsh winds wearing down the stone. Flint stood at its base, his tail flicking wildly as he stared up at the twisting path. The eagle's ragged cries kept slicing through the air, each one hitting him like a spark, urging him higher, closer, onward. Ash hung back, pressed against Liora's leg, trembling with unease. The valley had felt peaceful moments ago, but now every sound seemed amplified, edged with warning. Pebbles clattered from the ledge above, bouncing sharply off the slope. Each impact sent a pulse through Liora's paws, vibrations too subtle for the cubs to sense but unmistakable to her. Something in the ridge was shifting, something old, tired, and ready to give way. Flint darted forward again. Liora moved swiftly, blocking him a second time, her body low and tense. She gave a soft chuff of warning, a mother's firm command. Flint stopped, but the confusion in his eyes was clear. The bird was hurting. The bird needed help. Why were they standing still? He glanced back toward the ledge, ears pricked, breath quick. Ash tugged gently at his brother's ear, urging him to retreat, but Flint shook him off and inched sideways toward a cluster of rocks, leading to another possible ascent. The wind carried another scream from the eagle. Flint flinched, but instead of backing down, he took a quicker step, driven by instinct far too young to understand danger. Liora's muscles tightened. She tried to herd them backward. Ash obeyed, but Flint slipped past her ankle and scampered up the first curve of the trail. His paws sent loose gravel spilling down the incline, tiny stones ticking against the cliff like falling seeds. The path's narrow spine of rock trembled faintly under his weight. Liora's heart kicked hard against her ribs. She lunged up the slope after him, gripping the unstable ground with practiced precision. Ash remained below, staring up with wide, frightened eyes. Flint reached a small flat where the trail curved inward. He turned his head, expecting Liora to scold him, but the chastisement never came. Instead, she pressed her body between him and the exposed outer edge, forcing him against the inner wall. Her breath came out sharp, clouded with urgency. The metallic scent in the air grew stronger, corroded, bitter, unmistakably human-made. It seeped from the rocks, carried from whatever held the eagle captive. Liora sniffed again, and dread sank like a stone into her chest. The trap wasn't new. It smelled old, rusted, abandoned, and abandoned things were often unstable. She felt the earth beneath her paws throb with a faint ache, like the ridge was breathing shallowly, struggling to hold its weight. Flint trembled now, sensing her shift in energy. His reckless excitement drained into uncertain confusion. He pressed into her leg, letting her shield him from the drop. Liora moved ahead slowly, placing each paw with cautious precision, testing the stone with her weight before committing to the next step. The path narrowed further, squeezing them between a rising slab of sandstone on the left and a deadly plunge on the right. Shadows clung to the corners where the light couldn't reach. Ash, still below, whimpered. His cry bounced up the canyon walls, thin and scared. Liora called back with a soft rumble, trying to reassure him. Her voice wavered ever so slightly. Flint heard it. His ears flattened. This was the first time he'd ever sensed fear in her. And if Liora feared something, then the danger must have been real. A brittle crack split the air, small but sharp. Liora's head snapped up. A sheet of grit tumbled from the ledge above, scattering over the path like rain. The eagle thrashed again, the rusted wire rasping against the stone. The ridge groaned, a sound so faint a cub would never notice it. But to Liora it sounded like the earth whispering a warning, too late. She pushed Flint behind her, forcing him tight to the inner wall. Her whiskers trembled. The rock under her paws no longer felt solid. It felt hollow, like a crust covering something fragile beneath. She edged forward to test it. It bowed, barely, but it was enough. A sudden breeze swept through the canyon, rushing through the corridor of stone, carrying dust and the faint echo of the eagle's agony. Flint whimpered. Ash cried again from below. Liora turned her head to check on both, and the trail moved. Not much, not loudly, but she felt it drop half an inch. The subtle, deadly sag of rock beginning to give way under too much weight. She reacted instantly, trying to shove Flint backward toward the wider part of the path. Flint scrambled away, paws slipping. The ridge buckled. A crack snapped beneath them. The entire section of the ledge shuddered like a dying creature exhaling its last breath. Then it fractured. Stone split in a jagged line that raced beneath Liora's paws. Flint was flung backward onto firmer ground. Liora's hind paws scraped desperately for purchase, claws gouging at crumbling rock. Dust exploded upward, blinding her as the ledge she stood on simply vanished from under her. Ash screamed from below. Flint's voice cracked into a terrified, high-pitched cry. Liora fell, down into a cloud of shattered stone, down into the shadowed pit waiting beneath the ridge, down toward the cold, thick mud that would soon begin to swallow her whole. Liora plunged into the pit in a violent crash of mud and shattered stone. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs, sending a shock of cold through every muscle in her body. The mud wasn't soft. It was thick, dense, heavy as wet cement. It swallowed her almost instantly, surging up her sides, clinging to her fur, dragging her downward with a force that felt alive. Her paws thrashed instinctively, searching for solid ground, but there was nothing beneath her except shifting sludge that refused to hold her weight. She tried to push upward, but her movement only pulled her deeper. The mud clamped around her legs like brutal hands. Panic surged through her chest. She lifted her head, gasping for air, as the muck rose past her ribs. A bolt of pain tore through her shoulder. She twisted in reflex and saw the cause, a long shard of stone, sharp as a fang, jutting from her flesh where the fall had driven it deep. Blood trickled around the wound, turning the mud around her a dark, ugly swirl. Above, two small faces appeared at the jagged rim of the broken ledge. Ash stood frozen, trembling violently, eyes wide with terror. Flint pressed against him, ears flattened, his entire body shaking. Their cries rained down into the pit, thin, desperate pleas that echoed against the canyon walls. Liora tried to answer them. She forced a sound through her throat, but all that escaped was a strangled rasp swallowed immediately by the mud's greedy slurp. Her legs kicked again, sinking another inch. The cold bit into her bones. She clenched her jaw, fighting to keep her head above the rising muck. Ash took a frantic step toward the crumbling edge. Loose pebbles tumbled beneath his paws, bouncing into the pit. Flint lunged at him, shoving him back with every ounce of strength in his small body. Ash protested, crying, but Flint wouldn't let him move closer. He didn't understand why. He only sensed that the earth below would take anyone who stepped onto it. Liora watched them with rising panic. Her cubs, her whole world, were inches from danger themselves. She tried again to lift one paw out of the mud. It refused to move. The syrupy mass clung harder, sucking her down another inch. The shard in her shoulder shifted. Pain flashed white-hot across her vision. She gasped, trembling from the effort. Dust drifted gently from the broken ledge above, settling onto her mud-caked fur. The eagle cried again, somewhere behind the rocks, but the sound was fading, distant, almost hollow. The wind that earlier carried warning now felt cold and empty. Ash let out a high-pitched wail that cracked in the middle. Flint pressed himself into his brother, trying to steady him, but Flint's own body trembled so violently he could barely stay upright. Their tiny forms looked impossibly fragile against the towering walls of the pit. They didn't understand what was happening. They only knew their mother was sinking, and they couldn't reach her. Liora dragged one paw upward with every bit of strength she had. It rose an inch, then slipped, yanked back under. The mud swallowed it again with a wet, hideous gulp. Her shoulder screamed in agony. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts. She fought to hold herself upright, neck straining, muscles trembling with exhaustion. The pit felt colder now. The mud carried the chill of groundwater seeping slowly upward. She felt it climbing her belly. Another inch. Another breath stolen. The sunlit sky above her shrank into a small patch framed by jagged stone. Even the air felt heavier, thickened by fear. Ash's cries grew frantic. Flint tried to stop him from approaching the edge again, but his own resolve shattered. He pressed his paws to the rock and sobbed, calling for her, begging her to rise, to reach them, to be the invincible mother he believed she was. Liora blinked slowly, fighting the blur in her vision. She tried to lift her head higher. Her muscles shook violently from the strain. Her body slipped a little more, mud rising past her ribs toward her chest. She forced her head back up, gasping. She couldn't die here. Not where her cubs could see. Not where they would watch her vanish into the mud, helpless. But the cold crept upward, numbing her legs, numbing her strength. A small sound caught her ear. Water. A faint trickle from somewhere beneath the mud, feeding the pit. The spring hidden inside Redwater Ridge had begun to release more water as the day warmed. The mud pool was rising, not sinking. Dread crashed through her. The mud wasn't just a trap. It was turning into a grave. The canyon seemed to draw tighter around her, walls closing in with the weight of inevitability. The sounds of the world dimmed. Even the wind seemed to fall silent, as if holding its breath for what came next. Ash and Flint pressed together at the edge, their bodies shaking. Their cries softened into choked, helpless whimpers. Liora lifted her gaze, memorizing their faces. Two small cubs with wide, terrified eyes. Two pieces of her heart she had sworn to protect. She blinked, slowly, painfully. Her strength was slipping. The mud rose again. She fought for one more breath, one more lift of her head, one more second to stay above the surface for them. Her legs trembled. Her head dipped. Mud lapped at her chest like cold fingers. And the lioness who had always walked Redwater Ridge with certainty felt, for the first time, the shadow of a truth she had never allowed herself to imagine. She was losing. Far across the lower flats of Redwater Ridge, where the desert stretched into a patchwork of pale grasses and scattered mesquite, an old mustang moved with slow, deliberate steps. Hawk's coat, once a deep, coppery chestnut, had faded over the years into something sun-bleached and weathered. White hairs dusted his muzzle like frost left by time. He walked with the steady rhythm of a creature who had survived more seasons than most wild horses ever lived to see. He stopped at a shallow dip in the ground, where rainwater sometimes lingered after storms. Today, only a thin sheen remained, barely enough to dampen the sand. Hawk lowered his muzzle, tasting the coolness before lifting his head again. His ears twitched at the wind brushing across the valley. It wasn't just dust the wind carried. There, faint, distant, strained, a cry. Hawk froze, every muscle going still beneath his worn coat. The sound wavered on the breeze, thin but sharp enough to tug at something deep inside him. For a moment, he wasn't the old mustang standing under the Arizona sun. He was younger, much younger, trapped in a narrow ravine. A steel-jawed trap clenched around his leg, tearing flesh each time he moved. He remembered the panic, the choking fear, the helpless cries that scraped from his throat when he thought no one would hear him. The cry on the wind now carried that same desperation. He stepped forward. The breeze shifted, bringing the sound again, clearer this time. Not the scream of the eagle he'd heard earlier that morning. No, this was deeper, edged with dread. A cub's voice. Two cubs, maybe. High-pitched, frantic, trembling. Hawk's heart kicked hard. He began walking, then trotting, then running, pushing his old body harder than he had in years. His hooves pounded the dry earth, kicking up thin clouds of dust behind him. His joints ached, but the urgency drove him on, stronger than pain, stronger than memory. The cries grew louder as he climbed the lower rise of the ridge, the land sloping upward beneath his hooves. The wind flattened his mane against his neck. With each stride, the panic in those voices pulled him forward, until he reached the crest and saw them. Two lion cubs stood at the edge of a jagged break in the rock, their tiny bodies rigid with terror. One paced frantically, bumping into the other with panicked nudges. The older cub leaned dangerously over the rim, crying into the chasm below. Hawk stopped so abruptly that dust swirled around his legs. Instinct screamed at him to back away. Lions were predators, dangerous even when small, but the sound of their cries silenced that instinct. He recognized the raw fear in them. He had made that sound once. The cub closest to the edge spotted him. The tiny lion spun, puffing up, trying to look fierce, tail lashing, fangs bared in a trembling growl, but bravery slipped the second his sibling pressed into his side, sobbing softly. Hawk lowered his head, not in fear, but in a gesture of calm. He made no move toward them, no sound. He simply breathed, letting them see he meant no harm. The older cub hesitated. His growl faltered. Confusion flickered across his face. Hawk took one slow step forward. Then he heard it. A low, muffled groan rose from deep inside the pit. Not loud, barely more than a breath, but heavy with pain. He stepped closer, and the cubs parted just enough for him to see down the broken slope of loose stone. There she was, the lioness. Half submerged in thick mud, her head barely above the surface, her sides heaving shallowly. Blood streaked her shoulder in dark rivulets. Her body trembled with effort as she fought and failed to pull herself free. The mud clutched her like a living thing. Hawk exhaled sharply, nostrils flaring, not prey, not predator, just a creature suffering, just as he had once suffered. The cubs cried again, turning toward him as if pleading, although they didn't fully understand what they wanted from him. Something in their desperation pushed him past the last hesitation. He stepped to the very edge, peering down into the pit. Liora's eyes flickered open at the sound of his hooves scraping stone. She stared up, dazed, barely conscious. Hawk lifted his head and turned toward the horizon. There, far away, sunlight glinted faintly off metal. The ranger station. The memory slammed into him so hard his legs trembled. The day a man knelt beside him, prying the steel jaws from his bleeding leg, speaking to him in low, steady words. The day Hawk learned that not everything with two legs brought pain. He stomped once, snorted loudly, and turned away from the cubs. They cried out in confusion, thinking he was abandoning them. But Hawk did not slow. He ran, old muscles burned, his lungs squeezed tight. But he ran harder than he had in years, hooves pounding the desert floor as he carried with him the message the cubs could not deliver. Behind him, their cries faded into the wind. But the memory of their fear stayed with him, driving him toward the only beings who might understand a cry too broken for the desert to ignore. The ranger station sat low against the land, a squat building of sun-faded siding and cracked concrete, as if it had long ago accepted the desert's rule and learned not to stand too tall. Inside, the air conditioner hummed in a tired, uneven rhythm, pushing back just enough of the heat to make the room livable. Ranger Dalton Hayes sat hunched at his metal desk, reading glasses low on his nose, one hand wrapped around a mug of coffee gone stone cold. His knees complained from the early shift, a dull ache made worse by the cold mornings and hot afternoons that had shaped most of his adult life. On the wall across from him hung two framed photographs, one of a younger Dalton, ash-covered and smiling with a crew of smoke jumpers as flames rose in the distant background, and beneath it, a smaller photo, a mustang with a bloody leg, lying exhausted beside an open steel trap. Dalton's hand rested on the horse's neck in the picture. Hawk. Dalton rubbed his thumb against the coffee mug handle, remembering the feel of the trembling animal beneath his hands that day. The pain in Hawk's eyes, the relief when the trap finally gave way. The way the mustang had leaned into him afterward, shaking but alive. Dalton had never forgotten it. "Hey, boss," a voice called from behind the supply shelf. "Printer's jammed again." Sierra Vale stepped out from the storage room, holding a crumpled sheet of paper like it had personally wronged her. Her braid was messy, her sleeves rolled up, and her expression a mix of irritation and determination, typical for a ranger who'd learned far too quickly that administrative work was harder than rescuing a dehydrated hiker. Dalton blew out a low chuckle. "It jams because you bully it." "I bully it because it deserves it," she said, tossing the paper onto a chair. "These old machines should be in a museum." Dalton pushed himself up with a grunt. As he stood, something outside shifted. The light through the blinds dimmed slightly, as if the sun had been smudged by dust. He peered through the slats. The air looked hazier than it had an hour ago, a faint yellow cast spreading across the horizon. "Dust picking up early today," he muttered. Sierra joined him at the window. "Think it'll hit ridge level?" "Maybe. It's that kind of morning." Before she could reply, a sound cut through the thick quiet of the station. Hoofbeats. Fast. Dalton frowned. "Now who the hell?" He stepped out onto the small cement porch just as the pounding grew louder. Dust kicked up in a narrow plume along the dirt road. Sierra hurried out behind him. Then Dalton saw the shape barreling toward them. Hawk. The old mustang thundered across the flats with a speed that didn't belong to an aging horse. His mane whipped in the wind, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on the station with fierce determination. Dalton's breath caught. "What in the world?" he whispered. Hawk skidded to a halt only a few feet from Dalton, dust swirling around his legs. The horse's sides heaved, foam flecking the corners of his mouth. He tossed his head, nostrils flaring, snorting hard, as if trying to force Dalton to understand something immediately. Dalton stepped closer, one hand raised instinctively. "Easy, old friend, easy. What's got you?" A smell hit him, blood, and not the horse's. Dalton's eyes dropped to Hawk's back, and his stomach tightened. Smears of muddy paw prints streaked the mustang's shoulder and flank. Small prints, cub-sized. Sierra gasped. "Those are lion tracks." Dalton nodded slowly, dread coiling in his gut. "Fresh, too." The wind gusted sharply, kicking sand across their boots and sending a tremor through the heavy flag hanging on the pole. Sierra shaded her eyes, staring toward the ridge. If he came this far, something's very wrong. Hawk stomped his front hoof and jerked his head violently toward the distant rocks, eyes wide and burning with urgency. Dalton understood. He didn't know what had happened. He didn't know how bad it was, but Hawk had come for him. Again. "Sierra," Dalton said quietly, "Start the truck." She sprinted inside without another word. Dalton rested a hand on Hawk's cheek. The Mustang trembled beneath his touch. "You remembered the way," he murmured. "All these years, and you still remember." The truck engine roared to life. Sierra swung it around to the front, dust swirling in its wake. Dalton moved quickly, loading ropes, harnesses, a med kit, the pry bar, and the tranquilizer rifle into the back. Sierra jumped out and helped throw in a coil of climbing rope and the portable ladder. The wind rose again, harder this time. A dusty curtain rolled across the flats. Sierra squinted. "Storm's building. We go now, or we don't go." Dalton slammed the tailgate. "We're not leaving anything crying out there." Hawk trotted ahead of them onto the rough trail leading away from the station. Sierra climbed into the passenger seat. Dalton got behind the wheel, knees popping loudly as he did. "He's leading us," Sierra murmured. Dalton nodded and stepped on the gas. "Then we follow." The truck jolted across the uneven ground, trailing behind the Mustang as he ran just far enough ahead to guide them, but never out of sight. The sky darkened another shade. Dust blew across the horizon in churning veils. The ridge loomed closer, its jagged cliffs glowing like rusted iron beneath the rising storm. Somewhere inside that labyrinth of stone, a lioness was sinking, and two cubs were screaming for a help the desert almost never delivered. But today, help was coming. The road to Redwater Ridge turned rough long before Dalton and Sierra reached the canyon. The truck rattled violently over patches of broken stone and hardened washouts carved by old floods. Dust surged across the flats in rolling sheets, smearing the horizon in a thick, yellow haze. Sierra kept one hand braced on the dash, squinting ahead as the wind pushed against the windshield with rising force. Hawk ran ahead of them, cutting through the desert scrub with a determination that seemed to pull the truck forward like a rope. His hooves struck the ground with rhythmic certainty, even though the wind tugged at his mane and small rocks skittered in the gusts around him. Dalton watched the horse through the windshield, jaw clenched with worry. Animals didn't move like that unless something was terribly wrong, unless they understood there was no time left. A hard gust hit the truck, shaking it slightly. Sierra lifted her hand to wipe grit from the inside of the glass. "This storm's coming in fast," she said over the growl of the engine. "Visibility won't hold long." "We only need enough to find them," Dalton answered. The trail narrowed as they approached the ridge, the canyon walls rising like rusted iron teeth cutting into the sky. Hawk slowed, then broke left onto a faint footpath barely visible beneath scattered gravel. Dalton eased the truck around, tires grinding as they climbed toward the mouth of the canyon. When the path became too tight and cluttered with debris, Hawk stopped and turned to face them. Dalton understood immediately. "We walk from here," he said. He shut off the engine. The silence after the growl of the truck was startling, broken only by the rising wind and the distant rattle of shifting stone. Sierra grabbed the gear from the back, slinging ropes and the kit over her shoulder. Dalton took the ladder and pry bar, then placed a steady hand on Hawk's neck. The horse trembled beneath his touch, but his eyes remained locked toward the canyon, urging them to move. "Lead on," Dalton whispered. Hawk turned and trotted into the narrow passage. Dalton and Sierra followed on foot, boots crunching over gravel as the canyon walls closed around them. The wind funneled between the stone, amplifying its howl into a deep, echoing moan. Dust whipped in spirals at their feet. After several minutes, the path steepened, twisting sharply. A small rock slide clattered down the slope ahead of them. Sierra froze. That came from above. Keep low, Dalton said, ushering her forward. Hawk halted abruptly at the mouth of a tight rock throat where the canyon pinched inward. He stomped once, then stepped aside, giving Dalton a clear line of sight into the chasm beyond. Dalton looked, and his stomach dropped like a stone. The pit was narrow but deep, a jagged cavity where the ledge had snapped away. Beside the splintered edge stood two small cubs, so tiny against the vastness of the cliff, their bodies trembling uncontrollably. Flint pressed against Ash, both letting out thin, broken cries that barely carried over the wind. They were too close to the edge, far too close, and below them, Dalton's breath caught. God! The lioness, Liora, was nearly submerged. Only her head and the upper part of her shoulders remained above the thick mud, and even then, barely. Mud clung to her muzzle, her fur streaked with blood from the gash in her shoulder. Her breathing was ragged, her head sagging lower with every minute that passed. Each small struggle pulled her deeper. Sierra raised a hand to her mouth. She's going under. Dalton stepped forward, scanning the fractured ledge, the loose gravel, the unstable slope leading to the pit. He'd seen sink pits before. Most weren't deadly unless an animal panicked. But this one was different, denser, colder. Fed by a spring he could hear trickling beneath the surface. The mud wasn't just holding her. It was rising. "We don't have long," he said. A strong gust rushed through the canyon, sending another rattling shower of pebbles down the slope. The cubs flinched, but didn't back away. Instead, Ash took a trembling step toward the edge and cried out as loudly as his tiny lungs allowed. Flint shoved him back with his head, trying to protect him even through his own panic. Dalton dropped to one knee, leaning toward them slowly with an open hand. Hey, it's all right, little ones. We're here." His voice was low, steady, soft enough to thread through the wind without spooking them. Ash whimpered. Flint pressed closer to him. Sierra crouched beside Dalton, whispering, "They're in shock." Above them, the wind roared again, pushing dust into the canyon like a storm-driven tide. Hawk stood at the entrance, ears pinned forward, muscles coiled tight with anxiety. He stomped once, snorting sharply, as if trying to signal that time was slipping away. Dalton scanned the pit again. Leora's head dipped, 1 inch, then 2. Mud lapped at her jaw. Her eyes fluttered weakly. "She's drowning," Sierra whispered. Dalton rose, adrenaline snapping through him. "Okay, we set up here. Anchor point on that outcrop, ladder down the slope, rope to me." Sierra moved instantly, tying off the first rope around a solid rock projection jutting from the canyon wall. Dalton pulled off his gloves, tightened the harness around his waist, and hooked the carabiner to the main line. Ash released another broken cry. Flint answered with a trembling whimper. Dalton glanced at them, small, helpless, terrified. They didn't know what he was saying, but they felt the urgency. They felt him trying to help. The storm surged again, dust swirling across the rim like smoke. Dalton stepped toward the edge. Below him, Leora's head slipped lower, her muzzle brushing the surface. He lowered his voice. "Hold on, girl. We're coming." And with the storm building around them, with stone shifting above and mud rising below, the rescue began. Dalton edged closer to the fractured ledge, boots grinding against loose gravel as the wind howled through the canyon like a warning. Sierra kept a tight grip on the rope anchored to the outcrop. feeding it through her hands with careful tension. The storm churned overhead, swirling dust into the air and making the canyon walls blur in dim, shifting shadows. Liora's head slipped again. Mud surged up her neck, swallowing another inch of her strength. Her breaths came in shallow, ragged pulls, each one weaker than the last. Dalton lowered himself slowly down the unstable slope, using the rope to guide his weight. "Easy, easy," he murmured, though the words were more for himself than for her. Ash cried sharply above, his small voice splitting through the wind. Flint pressed against him, trembling so violently his entire frame shook. Hawk stood at the canyon entrance, stomping anxiously, ears pinned flat with worry. Dalton reached the last jut of rock above the pit. The mud below quivered with every tiny shift he made, as if eager to claim another victim. He locked his stance, knuckles white on the rope. "Okay," he whispered. "We do this slow." He unhooked the tranquilizer rifle from his harness and loaded a single dart. Sierra steadied the rope above, her voice strained. "Tom, that mud looks—" "I know." He didn't let her finish. If she panics, she sinks. I have to keep her calm. The mud bubbled weakly around Liora's shoulders. Her eyes cracked open at the sound of his voice, glazed, unfocused. Dalton lifted the rifle, aiming for the muscle above her foreleg. A rock clattered somewhere above. Sierra gasped. Dalton looked up, just in time to see a slab of stone break free from the ridge. It smashed against the slope beside him, sending a violent jolt through the ledge. Dalton jerked. The rope slipped half a foot. The rifle lurched in his hands. The dart knocked loose, tumbled end over end, and vanished into the mud with a soft, horrible plop. "No!" Sierra choked out. Dalton stared at the mud where the dart disappeared, his stomach falling like a stone. Without that shot, there'd be no way to steady the lioness if she thrashed. And if she fought the mud, she would drown before they could pull her out. "We're doing this the hard way," Dalton said under his breath. He lowered himself closer to the pit, boots slipping slightly on the brittle slope. Sierra tightened the rope instantly. "I've got you! I've got you! Move slow!" Liora whimpered weakly, her head sinking another inch. Mud lapped at her jaw. Dalton stretched out, reaching with one gloved hand until his fingers touched the surface of the sludge. He pushed deeper, found the space beneath her chest, and forced his arm in to keep her head above the surface. The cold hit like a shock. The mud crawled up his forearm, clinging like icy glue. Sierra shouted, "Tom, don't go in! If you lose footing, you're done!" "I'm not letting her go under." The pit pulled at his arm, greedy and relentless. Dalton gritted his teeth, bracing against the slope, muscles burning as he held her weight. Liora's breath shuddered, her strength fading. Above them, the wind roared, hurling dust into the canyon. The cubs cried out again, terrified and helpless, and then Hawk moved. Dalton heard the hooves first, sharp, urgent strikes against the rock. He twisted his head just in time to see the old mustang walking toward Sierra, far too close to the unstable edge. "Hawk, back!" Sierra yelled. But Hawk didn't stop. He turned sideways, presenting his flank directly to Sierra, positioning himself exactly opposite Dalton on the slope, exactly where a counterweight needed to be. Sierra froze, stunned. "Tom, he's offering himself." Dalton's heart slammed against his ribs. "Hawk," he breathed, barely able to form the word. The mustang held still, steady as an anchor point, eyes locked on Dalton with raw understanding. He stomped once, hard, bracing himself. Dalton snapped back into motion. "Sierra, secondary rope, Now! Sierra moved with shaking hands, grabbing the extra line and looping it around Hawk's torso. He didn't flinch, didn't take a single step away. He stood like a creature carved from the canyon itself. Sierra tied the line off and clipped it into her belay harness. Rope locked. Good. Dalton pushed deeper into the mud, gripping Liora's chest fur from beneath. The mud pulled back, resisting. Sierra leaned with all her weight, and Hawk stepped backward, muscles flexing, adding strength to the pull. Come on, Dalton grunted. The rescue strap slid beneath Liora's chest. Mud sucked at it like it refused to give her up. Dalton shoved, Sierra pulled, Hawk braced and leaned, hooves digging into the rocky earth. Then, a wet, wrenching sound cracked through the pit. Liora's torso broke free. Sierra cried out, "She's coming up! Keep pulling!" Dalton pushed from below, shoulder burning with effort. Liora's body rose inch by inch, mud cascading off her sides in thick sheets. Ash and Flint screamed from the ledge, voices lifted in frantic, hopeful cries. Hawk staggered as the weight increased, but he held, refusing to give in. Dalton could see his muscles trembling, veins standing beneath his hide. "Hold steady!" Dalton shouted. Sierra leaned back until her boots carved deep grooves into the dirt. The rope strained, creaking loudly. Dalton shoved upward again, every tendon in his arm screaming. The mud tried to claim her once more, gripping her hind legs. Dalton lunged, grabbing her fur, and forced her upward with a roar of effort, and then her body cleared the rim. Liora slid onto the rocky ground above the pit, collapsing in a trembling heap. Mud dripped from her sides, pooling around her. She gasped for air, weak but alive. Dalton collapsed against the slope, chest heaving. Sierra nearly fell backward with the release of tension, and Hawk, sweet, exhausted Hawk, stood frozen in place, the rope still taut around his body, breathing in harsh, ragged bursts. Ash and Flint rushed to their mother, crying soft, broken chirps that echoed through the canyon. They pressed their faces into her neck, shaking with relief. Liora lifted her head weakly and touched each cub with her nose. Dalton looked up at Hawk. The Mustang's legs trembled, sweat streaked his coat, but his eyes stayed fixed on Liora, steady and bright, as if he wouldn't allow himself to rest until he knew she was safe. "Good boy," Dalton whispered, voice cracking. "You saved her." The canyon went silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. A man, a lioness, and an old horse, bound by one impossible moment that none of them would ever forget. Liora lay trembling on the rocky ground, her breaths uneven, shallow, but no longer fading. Mud dripped from her fur in thick ribbons, forming dark pools beneath her. The canyon air, once sharp with dust and panic, slowly softened as the wind's fury eased. Above her, the sky brightened just enough for the sun to reach the canyon floor, casting thin beams across her battered body as if the valley itself was exhaling in relief. Ash pressed himself against her chest, letting out broken little chirps as though urging her to wake. Flint curled tightly beneath her chin, his tiny paws kneading anxiously against her muddy fur. They nudged her again and again, desperate for the warmth that had always meant safety, home, and certainty. Liora's ear twitched faintly. Her tail gave a weak flick. Ash chirped louder, hope cracking through his fear. Sierra knelt beside the lioness with her medical kit, hands steady even though her eyes still carried the shock of what they had just witnessed. She uncapped a bottle of water and poured it gently over Liora's wounded shoulder. Mud washed away in dark streaks. revealing torn flesh and the embedded shard that had caused so much agony. Liora flinched, but did not lift her head. Sierra leaned in, murmuring quiet reassurance even though she knew the lioness couldn't understand the words. Dalton, still covered in mud up to his elbow, knelt on Liora's other side. His chest rose and fell in heavy, exhausted waves, but his eyes stayed locked on the lioness as though he needed to witness every breath she drew. He reached out and brushed away a clump of mud near her muzzle. "You're all right," he whispered in a voice hoarse from grit and adrenaline. "Just stay with your cubs, girl. You made it." A soft sound rumbled from the edge of the canyon wall. Dalton lifted his head. Hawk stood where Sierra had unhooked the rope, his sides heaving, his coat darkened with sweat. His legs wobbled, but he held himself tall, eyes fixed on the recovering lioness. The old mustang's breath came in deep, shuddering pulls, yet nothing, neither exhaustion nor fear, pulled his gaze from her. Sierra glanced up at him and felt her throat tighten. "He's watching over her," she whispered. Liora stirred again. Her eyelids fluttered, heavy with shock and fatigue. She blinked once at the cubs pressed against her. Then slowly, painfully, she lifted her head halfway. Ash squeaked. Flint let out a soft mewl. Their mother's warm breath washed over them, and both cubs nuzzled into her with trembling relief. Dalton exhaled, a shaky, broken laugh leaving him. "There you go. Good girl." But Liora wasn't looking at him. She turned her head farther, movements stiff and weighted, until her eyes settled on Hawk. For a long, breathless moment, neither creature moved. The wind curled quietly through the canyon, brushing dust across the stone. Ash and Flint watched from beneath her chin. Sierra lowered her hands, frozen mid-motion. Dalton felt something inside him settle into a deep, reverent stillness. Liora blinked once, pupils widening. She shifted her weight, slow, deliberate, and lowered her head toward Hawk. Not a warning. Not a threat. A gesture older than language, a gesture of recognition and gratitude. Hawk's ears twitched. The tremor in his legs eased. He inhaled deeply and lowered his own head in return, dipping it with the slow, dignified grace of an old warrior acknowledging another. It was silent. It was simple. It was impossible. Three species who should have feared one another, instead, stood bound by one fragile thread of shared life. Ash and Flint looked between their mother and the mustang, sensing something calm in the space between them. Flint stepped forward and gave a small, tentative chirp toward Hawk. Hawk blinked, as if startled by the tiny courage of a cub barely bigger than his hoof. Sierra wiped her eyes discreetly. "I'll never see anything like this again," she whispered. Dalton swallowed hard. "No," he murmured. "You won't." The canyon, moments ago filled with cries of terror, now held a silence so pure it felt sacred. Liora lowered her head again, resting it gently atop her cubs. They curled into her warmth, finally still. Sierra placed the emergency blanket over the lioness's back, shielding her from the lingering chill of the mud that matted her fur. Above them, sunlight filtered through the clouds, landing on the lioness, her cubs, and the old mustang standing guard. It was not a rescue anymore. It was a miracle shared between three worlds. For a long while, the canyon remained wrapped in a deep, reverent quiet. Liora rested with her cubs tucked against her, their small chests rising and falling with fragile, steady breaths. The mud that had nearly claimed her clung in dark streaks to her coat. but her eyes were clearer now. The haziness lifting like fog burned away by morning light. Ash nuzzled into her chest, refusing to let go, while Flint curled beneath her chin, his tail flicking in tiny, relieved motions. Dalton stepped back to give them space, his boots scraping softly over the stone. His body ached from the strain, every muscle trembling with delayed exhaustion. Sierra closed her medical kit with quiet care, wiped the last streak of mud from her sleeve, and let out a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. They both watched the Lioness in silence, knowing she needed the canyon's stillness more than anything now. Minutes passed, slow, fragile, precious. Then Liora stirred. Her ears flicked first, her breathing deepened. She lifted her head, eyes sharp despite the fatigue weighing heavily through her limbs. Ash and Flint looked up at her instantly, their bodies pressed tight with hope. Liora shifted her paws beneath her, testing their strength. Her legs trembled. She paused, chest rising with effort. And then, with a soft grunt, she pushed herself upright. Mud slid from her fur in thick sheets. She wavered once, catching her balance. Dalton instinctively took half a step forward, but Sierra touched his arm and shook her head. "Let her," she whispered. Liora stood fully, tall and steady despite the exhaustion dragging through her bones. Ash rubbed against her foreleg. Flint circled her heel twice, chirping in a rapid, fluttery rhythm. She lowered her head, nudging them each in turn, urging them close. Her posture shifted, not just in strength, but in intent. She was ready to move. Dalton felt something warm settle in his chest. "She wants to take them home," he murmured. Sierra nodded. She lived for them today. Liora turned toward the canyon's exit. Her steps were slow and uneven but purposeful. Ash stayed glued to her shoulder. Flint darted between her front paws, occasionally stumbling in the dust before catching himself. The three of them moved as one, bruised, limping, but undeniably alive. Hawk watched from a short distance away, his head lifted, his breathing calmer now. As Liora approached the bend in the canyon path, she paused and turned her head, eyes meeting the old mustang once more. It was not the look of a predator toward prey. It was something older, deeper, acknowledgement born in the space between death and rescue. Hawk lowered his head in return, a gesture of respect earned, not given. Liora blinked slowly, then continued forward. Ash and Flint glanced back at Hawk briefly before scrambling after their mother, their small paws pattering against stone. The three figures slipped into the narrowing trail, the lioness's tail gently brushing her cubs as they disappeared around the bend. Dalton exhaled through his nose, a soft, almost disbelieving sound. "They'll make it," he said quietly. Sierra smiled faintly. "And those cubs, they'll remember today for the rest of their lives." Hawk let out a long, slow breath. His body sagged slightly, finally giving in to the exhaustion he had held back through sheer will. Dalton walked toward him, reaching out to rest a hand against the mustang's neck. Hawk leaned into the touch, eyes closing, his breath warm against Dalton's sleeve. "You remembered kindness," Dalton whispered. "And you gave it back when it mattered most." The wind shifted gently through the canyon, no longer sharp or warning, but soft, almost grateful. Dust swirled lazily around them. Sierra looked toward the trail where the lioness had vanished. "We witnessed something unreal today," she said. Dalton nodded. "Yeah, but somehow it feels right for this place." Hawk turned toward the open desert. The breeze lifted his mane, brushing it back like a memory written in the wind. Dalton stepped away, giving the old horse room. Hawk took a few slow steps, paused, and looked once more toward the canyon mouth. Then he walked forward, steady, deliberate, and headed back into the wide quiet of Redwater Ridge. Dalton and Sierra gathered their gear and started the climb back toward the truck. Behind them, the canyon walls stood tall and silent, holding the echo of hoofbeats, the whisper of cubs' cries, and the miracle that had unfolded in their shadow. For a long moment, Dalton stopped and looked back. 3 lives saved, he murmured. Sierra corrected him gently. 4. Hawk saved himself, too. They continued toward the truck as the sun dipped lower, painting Redwater in warm gold. Far behind them, the miracle settled into memory, a story carried only by the desert, the wind, and the hearts of those who lived it.